All right, so today we're going to look at two things. So, first of all, we're going to talk about what's been happening in Britain during the sort of mid late 19th century period that we've been talking about. And then we're also going to look at developments in philosophy and culture during this time period. So we're going to start out in Britain, and Britain's political situation is pretty distinct from what we're seeing happen on the continent because we don't really see this big wave of revolution. So they don't participate in the 1848 revolution. We don't see any revolutions after that. So what's going on here? So the way Britain avoids that is they actually just give people what they want. So they pursue a series of liberal reforms, even under actually conservative prime ministers. And this basically expands the electorate, gives people more access to the political process, and this satisfies people. So there's that going on. And then, moreover, England does continue to do pretty well economically, and eventually this does trickle down to not only the middle class, but the working class as well. So I mentioned when we talked about the Industrial Revolution that kind of in the long run, GDP rises or the country produces more, and eventually the working class will see the benefits of that as well. Although, as we'll see when we talk about cultural developments, we do see some alternatives to this develop, so we'll get there. So when we look at Britain, we're actually going to look at it through the lens of three different prime ministers. So you got to know these names. Our first one is Lord Palmerston over there. He's a Whig. So if you recall, these were it's hard to call them liberals. They were like very, very, very moderate liberals, and Palmerston was definitely emblematic of this. He was really good at foreign policy, but sort of in terms of domestic policy, he was a real centrist, and he didn't really pursue a lot of big reforms. Now, in contrast is Benjamin Disraeli, who is a Tory. So these people, remember, that's sort of the nickname of the Conservatives now. This party is now officially named the Conservatives. And he actually pursues some kind of semi-liberal reforms. So the Reform Act of 1867 expands the electorate by lowering the monetary and property requirements for voting. So now the political system is more accessible to you if you're kind of in sort of that middle class, lower middle class area. So again, that's going to tamp down on revolution because if you have a legitimate outlet for your grievances, you're not going to go take to the barricades. Now, why did Disraeli do this? Well, he thought it would strengthen the Conservatives, but actually kind of backfired on him because by expanding the electorate, well, all those new people who joined the electorate, they were kind of in the Liberals constituency, so they ended up voting for them. Now you're wondering, wait, who are these Liberals we're talking about? I know the ideology, but it's with a capital, so it's not a political party. So what happens here is the Whigs, right, who are kind of those moderate Liberals, they end up merging with some other factions, and they create this new party called the Liberals. And actually, as a result of that, our next prime minister that we need to know, William Gladstone, is actually from this new Liberal party. And what he does is he takes those reforms that Disraeli made and he brings them a step further. So not only does he sort of expand the political system and allow more people access to political power, he also passes some reforms aimed at improving the living and working conditions of the poor. So kind of building on that earlier legislation we looked at last unit, like the 10 Hours Act and the Factory Acts. And he also limited corruption in the political system by introducing things like the secret ballot. So people don't know who you vote for until you've submitted the ballot, right? We have that in the United States. He also introduces civil service exams. So basically, it used to be that you got promoted into the government based on, who your connections were. But now Gladstone is saying, no, it actually has to be based on skills. So you have to prove you know how to do the job you're being hired to do. And interestingly enough, once you guys take U.S. history, you'll find out we introduced some reforms over here in kind of the same time period. So nice little connection there. All right, and there we go. There's Disraeli, and there's Gladstone. And see, photography is getting better too. All right, so that's Britain, right? They pursue this series of liberal reforms, kind of lowers the tension a little bit. People get what they want. But liberal reform is really only one solution that was proposed to all the problems of industrialization. And even though people's lives in Britain are generally getting better, we know that industrialization on the continent is lagging a little bit behind. So a lot of the working class there is still suffering just as much as before, right? So in the middle of the 19th century, a really new version of socialism is going to emerge to challenge liberalism. So remember, socialism is kind of the ideology of the working class. We looked at people like Robert Owen last unit, but now we're going to look at the granddaddy of European socialism, and this is Karl Marx, whose name you might be familiar with because it's all over the news still. And this version of socialism is sometimes called Marxist socialism or just Marxism. So who was Karl Marx? So he was actually a journalist. He was German. He was middle class. He was born actually to a Jewish family, but they converted before he was born, so he didn't really identify as Jewish. And he actually worked together with Friedrich Engels, who we met last unit. He was that son of a wealthy German industrialist who traveled to Manchester and who was absolutely horrified by what he saw there. So he actually kept working for his dad, made a lot of money, and then he gave that money to Karl Marx. And Karl Marx took that and he wrote quite a lot as a journalist. So he wrote most famously a book called The Communist Manifesto, as well as a book called Capital. And although this ideology that Marx espoused was really similar to this earlier utopian socialism that we looked at last unit, so it's all about sort of liberating the working class and guaranteeing economic equality, Marx's whole thing was that his theory was scientific. Like, I had this professor who said this every time he talked about Marx. Marx taught himself calculus so he could prove communism with math. So that's how Marx is approaching this. He's like, this isn't some airy fairy, we're all sitting down and singing Kumbaya. This is science, people, according to Marx. So what is this theory that he argued about? So basically what Marx said is that society is based on this system of class struggle. So it changes what classes are struggling with each other over time. But in the 19th century, he says society is based on a class struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the bourgeoisie, you know, they're this industrial middle class, right? Well, who's the proletariat? This is the working class. And basically what Marx said is that capitalism has in it the seeds of its own destruction. So the bourgeoisie relies on the labor of this underprivileged working class, and eventually they're going to treat them so badly and work them so hard into the ground that the proletariat is going to have no choice but to rise up against the bourgeoisie and seize the means of production. Well, what's the means of production? Basically, seize the factories, right? So now eventually it's going to be the workers running their own darn factories, not those bourgeois, factory owners, right? And what would the workers do once they have achieved this goal? Well, then they're going to create a new classless society, and everybody's going to be equal, and they're going to redistribute property so everyone has the same amount of stuff. All right. So Marx said this was going to happen naturally. Basically, like capitalism, it's inevitable. It's going to treat workers so badly. They're just going to get so angry and fed up, they're going to rise up. But he also believed at the same time it was important to actually do some organization and organize working classes across Europe. So he's very much an internationalist. So he didn't found, but he participated in this thing called the International Workingmen's Association. And this was actually an umbrella trade union group. So if you remember, trade unions, those are organizations of workers, right, that aim to get better working conditions and benefits and things like that, better safety conditions. And the International Workingmen's Association actually doesn't last very long, so it collapses in 1872. But what it does is it sets a precedent for organizing workers based on their social class, not their nationality. So communism or socialism, and I'll explain the difference between those two things in just a second, actually emerges kind of as a challenge to nationalism in an interesting way, because this is about organizing people based on class, not nationality. Now, you might be, wait, I've heard those two terms, communism, socialism, I've heard Marxism described as all those words. What does that mean? It is kind of funky. So some Marxists themselves will use the term communism to kind of refer to this end stage in Marx's prediction about what's going to happen to society. So like this classless society where there's no government and everyone is working in harmony together. Socialism is kind of this intermediary stage where the working class has seized control of the means of production and is working towards building communism, but they're not quite there yet. They haven't totally achieved this classless society. But the thing is, this distinction kind of emerged after Marx died. He didn't really use those words. And so what I'll try and do is refer to Marx's philosophy as Marxism, and it's just basically one of the flavors of socialism. It gets really confusing. Know that these things are all kind of in an umbrella, so don't worry too much right now about getting sort of defining them specifically, because if you want to do that, you can go on socialist websites, and believe me, they will argue about it. All right, there's Karl Marx. My high school history teacher said he looked like Santa who got rolled in coal. And I'm like, a little bit. All right. So Marx argued, right, that his whole philosophy was based on the scientific study of human history. People will kind of refer to him as like the first sociologist or social scientist, and other people kind of followed in his footsteps and applied those same methods, even if they didn't necessarily come up with the same conclusion. You can also kind of look at this as an extension of the Enlightenment, because we know a lot of Enlightenment philosophers, our Locke's, our Hobbes, our Rousseau, were also really interested at looking at society from kind of this scientific perspective. Another name you're going to need to know for this unit is Auguste Comte. He was another early sociologist, and he's a founder of this ideology called positivism. Positivism, I can say that. So this actually spreads across different fields. We see a lot of big scientific discoveries during this time period. So biology is another really important field where new scientific discoveries are made. And actually it kind of ends up influencing social science as well. So how does that work? So the really famous name we associate with biology in this 19th century time period that we're talking about is Darwin and his book On the Origin of Species. So you've probably heard about him in maybe like a bio class, and his whole ideology, right, or his belief system, not belief system, his theory, it was a scientific theory, he had evidence for it, was survival of the fittest. Now, what does that mean? So survival of the fittest means that organisms who are best suited to their environment survive and pass on their genes, right? So birds with beaks that are uniquely adapted to the environment where they live, they can eat the food, they can go on to reproduce, their babies will have similar beaks, right? And then that will get passed on and on and on and on. Now, there were some intellectuals who read Darwin and totally misunderstood him, and they really misunderstood that word fittest. And basically they believed fittest was strongest, right? So there's sort of survival of the strongest, right? And they're like, okay, so people and animals who are stronger and tougher and badder than everybody else, they're gonna survive. Not only will they survive, it's somehow they have like this God-given right to take over everybody else. And so social Darwinism is the name of this ideology is social Darwinism. So this misinterpretation of what the fittest means applied to society. People will go on to use that ideology to justify all kinds of nasty things. We will circle back to social Darwinism next unit when we talk about the second wave of imperialism in Europe. All right, other major scientific discoveries, also in biology, we see a lot of improvements in public health and medicine. So we see germ theory emerge for the first time. So no longer is disease caused by allegedly bad smells or wandering wombs or whatever. Now it's actually caused by microorganisms. And the people we have to thank for this are Pasteur and Koch. By the way, put these names on a flashcard because you will see them again. Another important discovery that it's made is sterilization, and the name we associate with that is Lister. And then something that is extremely relevant in 2021, immunization, and we can thank Jenner for that. Now, these discoveries led to improved training programs for doctors. Most of these doctors were men. We see medical schools mainly open to men, but we do see some women become doctors as well. And these new discoveries actually fuel improvements in public health. So improved sanitation, we see public immunization programs, things like that. And the emergence of anti-vaxxers too, because such is life. All right, so now we're going to end on some artistic developments here. So the trend we have to remember for sort of this mid-late 19th century period is called realism. Now, these people are definitely in contrast to the Romantics we talked about last unit. They didn't really want to portray sort of like this idealized, misty, weird version of reality. Nope, they just wanted to display reality as it is. In my opinion, a little bit boring. The main audience for these works, especially realist literature, was this new sort of industrial middle class. Big difference there, and especially women, actually. So you have all these housewives sitting at home, and what are they going to do? They're going to read some novels. So what are they going to read? There was a French author, Gustave Flaubert, who wrote a book called Madame Bovary, William Thackeray, who wrote Vanity Fair, the entire works of Charles Dickens, so like Bleak House and A Tale of Two Cities and all of that. And then in terms of visual artists, we see a lot of French artists actually in realism, so Gustave Courbet and Jean-Francois Millet. And here is an example of realism. So it's some folks sifting wheat, a very realistic depiction of it, in fact.